I remember what the sun looked like. Not the weak, watery light we have now, the filtered gray that seeps through the ash cloud on good days, that tastes like old metal when you stand in it too long, that produces a specific low-grade headache if you expose your bare skin to it for more than 20 minutes without the standard UV suppressant applied to the neck and forearms. I mean real sunlight. The kind that sits on your shoulders like a warm hand and makes you close your eyes without thinking about it. The kind that turns the undersides of leaves silver at midday. The kind you don't notice until it's gone because it was simply the condition of the world, like gravity, like breathable air. Something you trusted without examining because it had never once given you reason to doubt. I had a daughter who used to hold her face up to it with her eyes closed, like she was drinking it in. She did it in the backyard on summer mornings in her pajamas with her feet bare on the grass, arms slightly out from her sides, chin tilted up. I used to watch her from the kitchen window while the coffee brewed and think that she was the most complete thing I had ever seen, fully herself, not reaching toward anything, not performing anything, just standing in the light. She was 7 years old when they took her. That was 6 years ago. My name is Davis. I don't use a first name anymore. First names are for people who still have families to say them. I am Dr. Davis, lead researcher, Thompson Island facility, and I have been alone on this rock for 11 months with a skeleton crew, a failing generator, a captive that should not exist, and the growing certainty that the rest of humanity is losing this war so thoroughly that by the time anyone sends a resupply, there will be no one left to send it. Let me tell you about the Triad. They are not what the early broadcasts called them. The networks in those first panicked weeks reached for words like vampire, demon, goddess, words that put them in a category humans already had a drawer for, words that made them feel manageable, named, filed away. It was the worst possible mistake, and I think we are still paying for it. They are none of those things. They are something older, something that does not fit in any drawer we have built. 3 of them as far as anyone has been able to determine. 3 sisters, though that word is also wrong, it implies biology, family, the shared warmth of a common origin. What the Triad shares is not warmth. What they share is purpose. The biology, as best I can reconstruct it from 6 years of study and 11 months locked in a room with one of them, is this. They are partially incorporeal. Not ghosts, not spirits. Something in between matter that exists in a state of controlled phase shift, allowing them to move through solid surfaces when they choose, to appear and disappear without transition, to be present and absent at once in a way that breaks every model of consciousness I was trained to trust. When they feed, they become fully physical. That is the key detail. I will come back to it. Their strategy when they revealed themselves was so precisely calibrated to human psychology that I believe they had been watching us for a very long time before they moved. Maybe generations, maybe centuries. First, the children. They took the children in a single night. Not all of them, everywhere, just enough. Enough in enough cities that every human parent on the planet woke up the next morning with the same compound fracture in the chest, that specific agony that has no analogy outside itself. My daughter's name was Nara. She had her father's mouth in my hands, and she could name every constellation visible from our backyard by the time she was 5. She used to fall asleep in the crook of my arm and make small sounds like a cat when she dreamed. I identified her genetic material in a Triad feeding site 14 weeks after she disappeared. I kept working. There was nothing else to do. The children were the overture. The main movement came 72 hours later when the Triad, or some mechanism they had prepared far in advance, something distributed across the upper atmosphere, a biological aerosol we still don't fully understand, seeded the ash. It didn't kill everyone. It didn't need to. It just made daylight conditional, survivable in short doses with gear lethal for prolonged exposure without it. They didn't take the sun away entirely. They just made it unreliable. They took away our certainty, our confidence, our morning routine. Humans, it turns out, are deeply dependent on their morning routine. The first 2 years of the war went badly. You know this if you were alive for it. The cities fell in waves, not to a military force, not to anything you could shoot at, but to that compound fracture that had been cracked open with the children and was now infected by the ash. People stopped trusting the sky, stopped going out, stopped looking at each other because looking at each other meant admitting that the thing in the other person's eyes was the same thing you were carrying. Grief is contagious. Despair is contagious. The Triad apparently understood this in a way that no military strategist we had managed to breed in all of human history had ever understood it. By year 3 we had adapted. Humans always adapt. It is our most reliable and most annoying quality, and I say that as someone who has spent her adult life studying biological systems. Every organism adapts, but humans adapt in ways that shouldn't work. We adapt through spite, through stubbornness, through some irrational refusal to accept the obvious conclusion. We adapted to the ash, found ways to filter and treat the light, developed new crops for the underground labs, rebuilt supply chains through tunnel systems and armored convoys. We stopped expecting the sun and started working with what we had. Year 4, Command decided to try capturing one of the Triad. I was not part of that operation. I was in a field lab in what used to be Ontario, cataloging tissue samples from feeding sites, building a database of Triad biology one ugly fragment at a time. But I know what it cost. 43 soldiers and 2 researchers dead to get Sariel contained. 43 people, for one creature in a sealed chamber. She arrived at Thompson Island 5 months later. They sent her to me because I was the only researcher who had published anything approaching a coherent biological model of the Triad. They sent 6 soldiers to guard her and told me my mission was simple: find out how to kill her. Simple. The island itself is about 40 kilometers of nothing, sitting in water cold enough to stop a heart in 20 minutes. The rock is volcanic in origin, mostly basalt, with a surface that grips at your boots when you walk it and gives back nothing, not even an echo. The wind takes everything. In better times it might have been called desolate. In the present climate it was simply honest. Nothing about Thompson Island pretended to be more hospitable than it was. After the compound grief of the city installations, with their auxiliary heating and their attempts at morale lighting, and their carefully maintained fiction that the situation was temporary, I had found the island's straightforward bleakness almost a relief. There's a research station on the northern end, built into the rock 2 levels below ground, one above, the above-ground portion sheathed in that filtered glass material that cuts UV exposure to something survivable without a suit. The sublevels are accessed through a series of reinforced blast doors, which are not subtle and were not designed to be. The people who built this installation were not optimistic about the future. They built for containment and for permanence, and they built it to hold something that did not want to be held. On a clear day, which we get maybe twice a month, you can stand at the window of the upper level and see the water all the way to the horizon. It's gray. It's always gray now. But it's big gray, and after enough time underground, big gray is almost beautiful. It reminds you that the world is still large, even if you can only stand in a small piece of it. It reminds you that the water was here before the ash and will be here after, whatever after means. When I arrived, the station was already occupied. The 6-soldier detachment was commanded by Major Cross, a tall woman, angular and quiet, the kind of quiet that is not peaceful but rather compressed, like a spring wound one turned too tight. She had been waiting on Thompson Island for 2 months before I got there, and she had not been given anything to do except keep the lights on and make sure Sariel stayed contained. Boredom had gotten into her soldiers like rot into wood. I could see it in their eyes at the first briefing. The 2 junior privates, Parker and Collins, had the flat look of people who had been running on maintenance-level purpose for too long. Hart, the senior private, was sharper. She had the discipline to manufacture her own purpose, but you could see the effort it was costing her. Then there was Starling. Starling was listed on the manifest as medical officer, but she was also something else, Something she'd been before the war, a therapist maybe, or a social worker. The paperwork was ambiguous and I never got the full story. She had a quality that I noticed before I had words for it. She was the only person in the facility who did not treat every conversation as an intelligence-gathering exercise. Cross-assessed. Heart-categorized. Parker and Collins watched and waited to see where you landed in whatever hierarchy mattered to them. All of this was reasonable, even necessary, in a sealed environment under pressure. But Starling simply looked at you directly, without an agenda visible behind her eyes. She had a way of listening that wasn't passive. She absorbed what you said and used it not against you, but for you, in ways that surfaced later in conversations you didn't expect. She was the first person on the island who asked me, without preamble or apology, about Nara, not as part of a security assessment, not because she needed to understand my motivations. She asked because she wanted to know. I told her. I didn't mean to. The name just came out, and then the rest of it followed, the whole shape of it, the backyard and the mornings and the sound Nara made when she dreamed, and the 14 weeks of not knowing, and then the genetic material at the feeding site, and the particular quality of grief that has no outlet because the thing you're grieving is not something that happened to you, but something that was taken from the world, which is a larger and colder thing. Starling sat across the mess table from me and let me talk until I ran dry. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't tell me it wasn't my fault or that Nara was at peace or any of the other things people say when they can't tolerate the rawness of someone else's loss and need to apply a bandage so they don't have to keep looking at it. She just listened, and when I was done she said, "That's why you're here. Good." I asked her what she meant. "You need it to matter," she said. "If you just wanted a career, you'd be somewhere safer. You're here because if you find what you're looking for, it's Nara who found it." I had not thought of it in those terms. I did not thank her for it, but I thought about it for weeks afterward, usually around 3 in the morning when the generator was cycling, and the hum of the containment unit formed the bass note under everything. The idea that the work was not a substitute for Nara but an extension of her, that the research was something she was in, the way a current is in a river, that she had not simply been lost, that she had been converted into something. I don't know if that's true. I'm a scientist. I hold things lightly when I can't test them, but I held that thought very carefully for 11 months, and it didn't break. Sariel was in the sub-basement, in a chamber we had reinforced with a material that had been reverse-engineered from the Triad's known vulnerabilities, a crystalline alloy that disrupted the phase shift, kept her anchored in something close to physical form. She was not comfortable in it. Comfort was probably not a concept that applied to Sariel in any way I could usefully measure, but she registered something in that chamber. A kind of diminishment. A reduction. She had been vast and she was now small, and the smallness sat on her like an insult she was too collected to express. I want to be precise about what she looked like, because imprecision is where mythology starts, and I don't have any patience left for mythology. She was tall, taller than any human, though the proportions were almost right, which is always the unsettling part. The uncanny valley works in both directions. Things that are too close to human produce revulsion. Things that are definitively alien produce fear of a clean, navigable kind. Sariel occupied a position precisely between those two responses, which I believe was not accidental. She was tall and the proportions were almost right, and her skin was the color of old bone, not white, not quite, more the color of something that had been white once and had aged out of it over a span of time that human adjectives don't adequately cover. Centuries. Longer. Her eyes were the particular feature that people, when they wrote about Triad encounters, consistently reached for inadequate language to describe. They were not a color. They were a depth. Looking at them too long produced in me a sensation I can only call structural, as if something in my architecture was being re-examined by an engineer who had built a different kind of building and was studying mine with professional interest and no particular warmth. I learned to look at her chin or her left shoulder, and to take my readings from the instruments rather than from direct observation. The instruments did not have the same problem. Instruments do not have architecture to examine. She did not speak in our first weeks together. She stood in the containment field and she watched me and I watched her, and I took measurements and ran models and she gave me nothing except her presence, which was itself a kind of data. An organism that has existed for as long as the Triad clearly does not give information by accident. Her silence was a strategy. I noted it and worked around it. What I knew going in, the Triad were feeding vulnerable. This had come out of the capture operation. One of the soldiers had gotten close enough during a feeding event to land a disabling shot. During feeding, the phase shift collapsed entirely. Whatever mechanism allowed Sariel and her sisters to move between states apparently required metabolic resources that were temporarily redirected during the act of feeding, leaving them fully physical for a window of time that the capture team had estimated at 60 to 90 seconds. Possibly longer. The soldier who'd made the shot said it felt longer, but adrenaline compresses and stretches time in ways that make eyewitness accounts of duration essentially worthless. 60 to 90 seconds of full physicality. That was what I had to work with. The question, and it had been the question for 4 years of scattered research before I arrived at Thompson Island, was how to exploit that window. You cannot bait an apex predator. You cannot set a trap for something that has been hunting humans for, at minimum, decades and possibly much longer. The soldiers who died in the capture operation died because they got lucky with the timing, and then immediately lost people to Sariel's recovery. Getting one of them into a forced feeding state in a controlled environment, in a way that didn't also produce a massacre, was the problem I had been hired to solve. I ran 97 simulations in the first 3 months. None of them worked. They all had the same failure point, the window. 60 seconds is not enough time for a human being to move from observation to action in a way that reliably produces a kill. We are too slow. Our reaction times are wrong. Our reflexes evolved for a world of other mammals and our own blunt tools, not for a predator that can phase through solid matter and recover from a disability state in under 2 minutes. The soldiers in the capture operation had managed it once, under the specific conditions of a genuine encounter, fueled by adrenaline and the particular clarity that comes when the only alternative to acting is dying. Replicating that in a controlled environment, without the chaos and the blood and the specific biochemical cocktail of combat, was like trying to replicate lightning with a battery and a wire. Technically the same principle, practically nothing alike. I hit the wall on simulation 97, and I sat in my workstation chair for about 40 minutes doing nothing, which is something I had not done since before Nara disappeared. Not sleeping, not processing, just sitting. The hum of the generator, the faint antiseptic smell of the facility, the blue-white emergency lighting that always made the room look like the inside of something medical. Then I started thinking about it differently. Not how to kill Sariel during the window, how to make the window longer. This is where biology becomes useful. Feeding is a metabolic process. All metabolic processes can be disrupted. The question is whether disruption extends the vulnerability window or simply terminates the feeding event. If it terminates the event, Sariel recovers immediately and we are back where we started with fewer personnel. But if disruption stretches the event, keeps her locked in the physical state, while her system struggles to complete what it started. I began testing, carefully, at distances that I hoped were safe, using the environmental controls of the containment chamber to modulate the conditions around her. Temperature, atmospheric composition, electromagnetic field strength. Watching her response markers, she had response markers, even if she wouldn't speak. The phase shift leaked light at certain frequencies when it was under stress, a faint luminescence at the edges of her form that I had calibrated instruments to detect. In month 6 she spoke. Not to give me information. I understood that from the first word. She spoke the way a chess player speaks when they move a piece to observe the effect on the other player. She said, in a voice that had no accent because it predated the concept of accent. "You grieve." I said yes. She considered that. There was a pause that lasted what felt like several minutes and might have been 30 seconds. Then, grief is a signal. It indicates something valued has been lost. Another pause. Humans persist in experiencing it even when the loss cannot be recovered. I said yes again. "We find this difficult to understand," she said. And there it was, not information, not vulnerability, but the first real crack in her silence. She found something difficult to understand. About us. About the persistence of grief. I wrote it down and I kept working. The resupply didn't come in month 7. Cross made note of it in the operational log and sent the standard emergency query through the satellite relay, which returned nothing. We weren't alarmed. Not yet. Resupply schedules had been erratic for years. The war had disrupted infrastructure in ways that made military logistics essentially a creative exercise. But Cross posted heart on additional watch rotations, and I noticed that she started eating less. Officers who are quietly calculating odds always eat less. It's a conservation instinct that emerges without conscious thought. I recognized it because I had been doing the same thing since month 3. In month 8, Starling brought me a cup of something that was attempting to be coffee and sat down across from my workstation and watched me until I looked up. "You're close," she said. I told her I didn't know that. "You look different than you did when you arrived. When you arrived, you looked like someone solving an equation. Now you look like someone reading the answer." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "What did she tell you?" I said Sariel hadn't told me anything useful. "You've been different since she started talking," Starling said. She was not accusing me of anything. She was simply nodding an observation the way I noted observations. "She asked you something last week. Parker was on watch. She said you stood there for a long time after." I had not known anyone was watching. I thought about being irritated by it and decided not to bother. "She asked me whether I would stop," I said. Starling waited. "Whether I would stop grieving," I said. "If I could." She wanted to know if it was voluntary. Starling was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell her?" I told her no. I told her it wasn't a choice. I told her grief is the price of love, and if you could simply elect to stop paying it, you could also elect to stop loving. And if you could do that, you weren't the thing she was studying. You were something else. The mug was warm in Starling's hands. She looked at me for a long time. "And?" she said. I stopped. The memory of it was strange, not because of what Sariel had said, but because of the quality of the silence before she said it. A silence that felt, for the first time, like something other than strategy. She said, "Then you are harder than we calculated." We didn't say anything else for a while. I went back to my simulations that night, but I was running a different model, not feeding disruption, something I hadn't considered because it required a premise I had been avoiding. What if the feeding vulnerability window isn't a physiological accident? What if it's the point? The Triad, in everything I had studied, showed no behaviors that were accidental. Their strategy around the children, around the ash, around the slow psychological erosion of human civilization, every element was precise, long planned, and aimed at a specific outcome. Nothing about them was careless. So the vulnerability during feeding, the collapse of the phase shift, the 60 to 90 seconds of full physicality, why would that exist in an organism this precisely constructed? Unless it was originally a feature. Unless, long before the Triad began preying on humans, the feeding vulnerability was the mechanism by which a natural predator could have killed them. Something that evolved alongside them. Some check in the system, the kind of biological counterbalance that appears in every stable predator-prey relationship we have ever observed in the natural world. Because predators without natural checks don't stay stable. They burn through their prey populations and then collapse. The Triad had been around too long to have made that mistake. They had evolved somewhere in something, and somewhere in that ecology there had been a mechanism for keeping them in check. And humans had inherited a world where that check was gone, because whatever had once occupied that ecological niche no longer existed, or had never existed here, or had been removed, eliminated, possibly deliberately, possibly as the first step in the Triad's long preparation for exactly this. And this was the thought that kept me awake until the generator cycled down, and the whole facility went to its emergency lighting, pale and blue-white and cold. Or we could be that thing. If we knew enough, if we moved fast enough, if we could extend the window from 60 seconds to something a human being could actually work with, if we could make the vulnerability last long enough for our biology to catch up to the problem. We had one advantage the original check probably hadn't. We were not purely biological. We built things. We augmented ourselves with tools. We had been doing it since before recorded history, using external systems to compensate for the limits of the bodies we were issued at birth. If the window was 60 seconds for a purely biological response, what could we do with 60 seconds and the right equipment? I went back to my test logs. The M modulation. Month 4, Test Series 11. The containment field at the right frequency had produced an anomalous reading on the phase shift sensors. Not a spike, not a collapse, but a flicker, a hesitation, like a muscle that gets a contradictory signal from two nerves at once and briefly fails to fire while the system sorts out which instruction to follow. I had filed it as an anomaly and moved on. It had looked like instrument noise. It had the right signature for instrument noise, and I had been looking at feeding disruption at the time, not phase lock extension, and my frame was wrong. I pulled it back up now. I ran the frequency analysis until my eyes ached, and the numbers started doing that thing numbers do after extended deprivation, where they seem to slide sideways on the screen if you look at them too directly. The pattern was there. Subtle enough that I dismissed it as instrument noise 14 times in month 4, but consistent across every instance where I'd applied that specific M range. The phase shift hesitated. Not for long. A fraction of a second, maybe 2. But hesitation is disruption, and disruption is a mechanism, and mechanisms can be engineered. The question was whether it was scalable. A fraction of a second hesitation at low power in a controlled test was not a weapon, but frequency engineering is not a linear problem. The relationship between power and effect in M systems can be non-linear in ways that are hard to predict without empirical testing. What produced a 2-second hesitation at containment field power levels might produce 30 seconds at higher power with directional focus, might produce more. I had no way to know without building something and testing it. I needed an engineer. I need to be careful here about what I am saying, because what I am saying is that I discovered the mechanism before I discovered the delivery system, and the delivery system was not my discovery at all. That was Ray's. He arrived on a Thursday. We don't usually track days of the week anymore. The week is a social convention, and social conventions have eroded along with most of the other things that required a stable society to maintain. But I remember it was a Thursday because I had been running a 72-hour test cycle, and Thursday was the last day of it. And I was at my workstation, compiling results when the proximity alarm on the exterior sensors went off for the first time in 11 months. Cross went to the upper level with Hart and Parker. Starling and I stayed below, near the containment bay, not because anyone had ordered us to, but because we both understood without discussing it that the highest value assets on the island needed protection, and we were the highest value assets on the island. Collins came down 20 minutes later and said they'd found a man. He was in bad shape, soaked through, hypothermic, with lacerations on his hands and face that had the specific pattern of someone who had been clinging to wreckage for an extended period, not smooth cuts, but ragged, worked-in gouges from something industrial, edges of metal decking or cargo strapping. His core temperature when Starling checked him was concerning. He was conscious and oriented, but moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who knew that his body was running on reserves, and that careless motion was expensive. He said his name was Ray, and that he'd been aboard a convoy vessel that had gone down 2 days north of our position. He said he was trying to reach shelter. Cross had him restrained. This was the right call, not because Ray was necessarily a threat, but because anyone who arrived at a classified research installation unannounced required security protocols regardless of their condition. Ray didn't fight the restraints. He cooperated with the medical check, answered questions in a steady voice when he was warm enough to speak clearly, and watched all of us with eyes that were evaluating something I couldn't identify. Not threat assessment, he'd already done that the moment he walked in. I could tell by the way his gaze had swept the room once, efficiently, and then settled. What he was evaluating now was something slower, something more like character. He was a problem from the first moment, and not in the way Cross was worried about. The problem was not that he was dangerous. The problem was that he was right. He told us, on his second day in the facility, that the war had entered a terminal phase, that the Northern Command had launched nuclear strikes at the primary Triad congregation site 6 weeks ago, that the fallout would reach this latitude in approximately 3 to 4 weeks, that the supply ships had stopped coming because there were no longer supply ships, or not enough of them, or the people who crewed them had stopped receiving orders from command structures that no longer functioned. Cross didn't believe him, not fully. She sent Hart to the far sensor array. There was a more sensitive atmospheric monitor on the island's southern end, broken for months, that Hart had the skills to partially repair, and she tightened the watch rotations and she stopped eating even less, which meant she was calculating very hard. I kept working. Starling, in the days after Ray arrived, made a decision that I did not fully understand at the time and that I understand better now. She brought him food. She sat with him when the watch rotation allowed for a gap. She asked him questions that were not security questions, not who had sent him, not how he'd found us, but what he remembered about before, what the cities had looked like, what sounds he missed from the old world. He told her, among other things, that he had been a sound engineer before the war, that he had worked in broadcast, calibrating frequencies and transmission equipment, that he knew more about electromagnetic wave propagation than was strictly useful for a man who had spent 3 years running supply convoys across occupied territory. When Starling told me this, I stopped what I was doing. I sat with it for about 30 seconds. Then I told her I needed to talk to him. Cross didn't want me to. She had specific, defensible objections. Ray was an unknown quantity. His story hadn't been verified. Allowing a research lead unsupervised access to an unvetted arrival was a security breach. All true, all correct. I told her I understood all of that and I needed to talk to him anyway. She gave me 10 minutes with Hart standing by. Ray was sitting on the edge of his bunk when I came in, hands loose in his lap, watching the door with that same evaluating expression. I sat in the single chair and looked at him for a moment before I spoke, because I wanted to see him clearly before I had an agenda about him. He looked like someone who had survived several things and was not surprised to have survived them, not proud of it, not relieved, just factually continuing. I asked him about M frequency modulation, not whether he knew what it was. I could see from his expression that he did, but how precise he could get with equipment cobbled from what we had on the island, what tolerances he could achieve. He asked me why. I told him about the phase shift hesitation. I told him about my 72-hour test cycle. I told him that I had identified a specific frequency range that produced a disruption in Sariel's phase shift response, and that if I was right, sustained exposure at that frequency during a feeding event might extend the vulnerability window from 60 to 90 seconds to something measurably longer. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "How much longer do you need?" I told him I needed 5 minutes. He looked at the ceiling. He was calculating something. I watched him do it, not the visible calculation of someone dramatizing their thought process, but the real thing, that particular quality of absence that settles over a person when they're actually solving a problem in their head rather than performing the act of solving it. He said, "I can build you what you need. I'll need to strip the emergency broadcast array, the 3 handheld relay units, and whatever spare copper windings are in the generator maintenance kit. And I'll need about 40 hours. I said, "You have 36. After that we start running out of time." He said, 36 then. Cross found out what we were doing around hour 12. She was not happy. She pulled me into the corridor outside the storage bay where Ray was working, and she told me, in a voice that did not rise but had significant mass to it, that I had violated her operational security protocols and compromised the integrity of the facility. I told her she was right. She waited for a but. I didn't give her one. I let her be right about all of it, and then I told her what I'd found and what I believed we could do with it, and I watched her face go through several things in quick succession: anger, doubt, calculation, something I can only call grief, and then something harder on the other side of the grief. She said, "What do you need from me?" I said I needed her to secure the containment bay and be ready with every weapon on the island when I told her we were starting. She turned and walked back toward the operations room. Halfway there she stopped. Without turning around, she said, "My daughter was 9. I said, "I know, I didn't know, but it felt true and I think it was." Hart, it turned out, had been listening. She said nothing, just fell in behind Cross and matched her pace, and I understood that the spring that had been wound too tight for 11 months had found its purpose. The atmospheric sensor results came back in hour 18. Hart had managed to get the southern array partially functional and the reading was unambiguous. There was fallout in the upper atmosphere. Not lethal levels yet, not here, not for another 2 to 3 weeks based on dispersal modeling. But it was there. Ray's story was true. The nuclear strikes had happened, and Command had made the decision they made, and we were sitting on a rock in cold water with a captured member of the Triad in 36 hours to work out a way to use her before the math became too ugly to ignore. I went back to my workstation and I worked. Zariel knew something had changed. I could not observe her continuously. The monitors in the containment bay showed her standing in the same position she had occupied for most of her 11 months in our custody, fully upright in the center of the chamber, hands at her sides, that faint luminescence at the edges of her form. But every time I checked the feed in the hours after we began preparations, I felt something I am not qualified to call intuition, but that functioned like it. She knew. She spoke again at hour 22. She said, "You have been building something." I was watching the monitor at my station, not in the room with her. Her voice came through the audio pickup flat and undistorted. I said, "Yes." "You intend to use the feeding state?" I said, "Yes." There was a long silence, long enough that I checked the monitor to confirm she was still there. She was. Then she said, "We did not calculate for this." I asked her what she meant. "Your grief," she said, "the persistence of it. We calculated that the loss of children would produce debilitation, extended paralysis. The evidence from the early period supported this model. Your population responded as predicted." Another pause. "We did not calculate that one individual would be able to convert grief to mechanism, to weaponize loss." I sat with that for a moment, then I said, "You've been studying us for a long time. Why did you miss that?" She said, "We have not experienced loss." I don't know exactly what I felt when she said that. It was not satisfaction. It was something more complicated. A recognition, maybe, that the specific damage the Triad had done to us was also the specific damage we were about to use to hurt them back. That they had created the weapon that was going to be used against them. That Nara, somehow, in a way that would never be sufficient or fair or adequate, mattered to what was about to happen. I went back to work. Ray finished the device at hour 31. It was not elegant. It looked like what it was: salvaged components and copper wiring, and 3 stripped handheld units crammed into a metal housing from the generator maintenance kit, with a directional antenna improvised from mesh sheeting that he'd pulled off one of the ventilation covers. He had calibrated it by hand, using nothing but a test meter and the frequency specifications I gave him, in 31 hours without sleep. When he handed it to me, his hands were steady. I noticed that. I asked him why he'd helped. He looked at the device for a moment before he answered. "My brother," he said. "He was on a resupply run. Convoy hit a Triad feeding zone 8 months ago." He paused. "He was 26. I said I was sorry. He said, "Stop being sorry and turn it on." We moved to the containment bay at hour 33. Cross had the 3 soldiers in position, Hart at the chamber door, Parker and Collins flanking the entry corridor, all of them armed with the modified weapons we had on the island, which had been refit 18 months ago for the specific purpose of engaging a Triad target in a physical state. Conventional rounds are largely ineffective. The modifications use a penetrant round developed from the reverse-engineered crystalline alloy, the same material as the containment chamber walls, that disrupts the phase shift on impact even if the creature is in mid-transition. We had 14 of them total. 14 rounds. Starling was behind me. I hadn't asked her to be there. She hadn't asked either. She was just there. Ray was at the door of the containment bay, outside the chamber itself, holding the device. His job was to maintain the signal, to keep the frequency emitter running at the calibrated range during the feeding event. My job was to trigger the feeding event. I need to explain this part carefully, because it is the part that is easiest to misunderstand. The Triad feed on fear, not metaphorically, physiologically. Fear produces specific biochemical markers in human blood: cortisol, adrenaline, a particular cocktail of stress hormones that the Triad have apparently been utilizing as a food source for as long as they have been feeding on human beings. It's why the taking of the children was so effective as an opener. A planet of parents in acute grief produces extraordinary quantities of exactly what the Triad eat. We had been from the beginning a supply chain. To trigger a feeding event in controlled conditions, you need a human being with elevated fear markers, available, contained, and producing the right biochemical signal. I had spent 11 months in a room with Sariel. I was, by any clinical measure, afraid of her. I had been managing that fear by converting it to purpose for 11 months, but the raw material was still there. What I needed to do was let it out. I stepped into the containment chamber. Cross said my name. Once. Not a command. More like an acknowledgement, the kind of sound a person makes when they know they cannot stop something and are bearing witness to it instead. I didn't stop. I walked to the center of the chamber. The containment field was a faint shimmer at the perimeter, visible only at certain angles, and the air inside was colder than the air in the corridor by several degrees. It always was. I had documented the temperature differential in my research notes and had 3 competing theories about the mechanism, and standing in the middle of the chamber, none of them mattered. I stood 5 meters from Sariel, and I let go of the thing I had been holding in compression since the day I arrived on that island. Not the grief. The grief was load-bearing. The grief was the engine. I couldn't release the grief without losing the thread that connected all of this to the reason I was doing it. What I released was the fear. All of it. The accumulated weight of 11 months in this room with something that should not exist. The fear of the dark and the ash and the cold water and the failing generator, and the 14 rounds that might not be enough, and the fallout creeping down through the upper atmosphere while we stood here making our plan. The fear that it was too late, that there was no one left to send the documentation to, even if it worked. That command was already gone, and the signals I was going to send were going to bounce around an empty sky and reach no one. The fear that the other 2 sisters, the 2 we had not caught, the 2 who were still out there moving through the war-torn dark, were already converging on Thompson Island because Sariel had been communicating with them in some frequency we couldn't detect, some mechanism of the phase shift we hadn't measured, and that we had 36 hours before the device was built and they had 12. The fear that Nara had been gone for 6 years and nothing I found in this room would bring her back, and I was going to do it anyway, because it was the only thing left that made the 6 years mean something. Because if I walked out of this chamber without finishing it, the 6 years were just damage, just loss, just the Triad's calculation proving correct. I was not going to let their calculation prove correct. I let the fear out, all of it, and I stood in it and I waited. Sariel moved. She had not moved, truly moved, not just the micro-shifts of her position in the chamber, in all the months I had known her. Now she moved the way the tide moves, without urgency, without any visible exertion. She came across the space between us and the light at the edges of her form brightened and then collapsed inward, and I felt the temperature drop by what my skin told me was about 15 degrees, and the feeding began. I have no precise clinical language for what feeding feels like from the inside. The research literature doesn't have it either because the people who could describe it from experience were mostly not alive to report. What I can tell you is that it was not painful in any conventional sense. It was more like something being tuned, like a radio being searched for a signal, moving through static, pulling something out of the noise. The cortisol and adrenaline and fear chemistry of my body being read and consumed. I heard Ray activate the device. The effect was not immediate and it was not dramatic. Sariel did not convulse or cry out. What happened was subtle. The inward collapse of her luminescence arrested. The phase shift, instead of completing its transition into a standard feeding state and then recovering, stalled. She was fully physical, more fully physical than I had ever seen her, the edges of her solid and sharp as glass, but she could not move between states. She was locked. She knew it immediately. The sound she made was not a word. I don't have a category for it. I know only that I heard it in my chest rather than my ears, a frequency that my body registered as alarm before my brain processed it as sound. Then Cross's voice, clipped and professional and utterly level. Heart. Now. 14 rounds. What I remember, the concussive pressure of the shots in an enclosed space. The smell of the crystalline penetrant, which is sharp and cold, almost like ammonia. Heart's breathing, controlled and rhythmic between rounds. Sariel's form absorbing the impacts without falling, which I had expected based on the biology. The disruption from each round was local, not systemic, and a creature that had been partially incorporeal for its entire existence has redundancies in its physical structure that a human body doesn't. But each round produced an expansion of the stall effect, the phase shift locking down further with each penetrant contact, the luminescence sputtering and failing and reigniting in the wrong places. By round 9, she was on the chamber floor. By round 13, she was still. I was still standing. I don't know exactly when I became aware of that, aware that I was upright and breathing and that the thing in front of me was no longer moving. It took a moment to map it correctly. Starling's hand was on my arm. I didn't remember her coming into the chamber. Cross was at my other side, and for a woman who had just fired or directed the firing of 13 modified rounds in an enclosed space, she was very calm. The kind of calm that comes after, not before. The earned kind. Ray had kept the device running. I could still hear its frequency, a faint subsonic pulse that the ears didn't quite catch, but the chest did. He had kept it running through all of it, standing at the door with his salvaged components and his brother, 26 years old, somewhere in the wreckage of the supply chain, steady as a man who has already made his peace with the cost. We stood in the chamber for a while. Nobody said anything. Eventually Cross said, "We need to reach command." I said, "We need to figure out if there's command to reach." She nodded. She had been calculating the same thing. "The device," she said, "how many can we build?" I looked at Ray. He had set the emitter down on the floor of the chamber, carefully, the way you set down something that has just done something important. He was looking at Sariel. He said, given what we have on the island, 3, maybe 4 more. After that you need a resupply. He paused. Or you need to take the principle and teach it to other engineers. Cross said, how long to document the specifications? I said, give me 6 hours. You have 4, she said, not unkindly, just precisely. I went to my workstation and I wrote, technical documentation, methodology, frequency specifications. The construction schematic Ray walked me through step by step, while I captured it in enough detail that someone who was not Ray could replicate the process. The biology of the phase shift vulnerability, the feeding trigger protocol, the penetrant round specifications from the weapons modifications report. All of it in the 4 hours Cross had given me, put into a document that a person without my specific research background could follow. I sent it on every frequency we had, through the satellite relay, through the emergency broadcast array after Ray rechanneled it, through the handheld units set to maximum range. I sent it to every known command frequency, every emergency network, every civilian relay still showing a signal. I sent it in multiple file formats so that whatever system was on the receiving end would have a chance of reading it. I sent it in plain text and in encoded packets, and in a format compatible with the pre-war military comms, standard that most field units had been issued before the infrastructure degraded. I don't know who received it. I don't know how many people were left with the capacity to receive it, the capacity to understand it, the capacity to act on it. The fallout was 3 weeks out, and I had no way of knowing what kind of world was on the other side of it. 3 weeks is a long time when you're losing. It is also a long time when you have something to work with. We had given them something to work with. That was the only thing I could control. What I know is this. The Triad have a vulnerability. They can be killed. They are not gods and they are not demons, and they are not anything that belongs in a category we built before we understood them. They are organisms with a feeding mechanism that leaves them exposed, and that exposure can be extended with the right equipment. And when it is extended long enough, they are as mortal as anything else that draws on biological processes to sustain itself. Mortality is not a human invention. It applies to everything. We had just needed to find the lever. They calculated that grief would break us. They were not entirely wrong. It did break us in the early years in ways we are still accounting for, but they missed the thing that comes after the breaking. They have not experienced loss. They did not know that loss in a human being does not simply persist. It metabolizes. It becomes something that cannot be undone or argued out of or waited out. It becomes the reason you are still at your workstation at 3 in the morning. The reason you do not stop. The reason you take the last injection of cortisol markers you have and walk into a containment chamber with a partial weapon and 13 rounds, and a man with a salvaged transmitter, and a major who lost her daughter and a medic, who lost her own piece of the world she used to live in. They chose to prey on the species that invented the word stubborn. They chose wrong. The night after Sariel fell, I sat at my workstation for a long time without working. The generator was cycling. The emergency lighting was the usual pale blue. Through the upper-level windows, I had gone up for the first time in weeks, just to be in a room with exterior walls. The sky was the usual gray. But the atmospheric sensors read a change in the ash density, minor, the kind of variation that might mean nothing or might mean that something in the upper-level distribution had shifted. We had no way to know yet. Hart made something from the remaining rations that was technically a meal. We sat around the mess table, all 6 of us, and ate it, and nobody spoke for a while, and then everybody spoke at once, and then we were laughing, not at anything in particular, just at the fact that we were still here, still breathing, still generating the specific biochemistry that had almost got me killed and had instead killed something ancient and very wrong. Ray caught me looking at him at one point. He said, "You going to sleep?" I said, "Probably not." He said, "Yeah." And that was that. I wrote one more thing that night after the others had found what rest they could. Not technical documentation, not a report. I wrote Nara's name at the top of a blank page. And then I wrote everything I could remember, the constellation she knew, the sound she made when she dreamed, the specific warmth of a 7-year-old asleep in the crook of your arm. I wrote it because it was real, because it had happened, because the Triad had been wrong about grief. It is not only a signal that something valued has been lost, it is also a signal that something valued existed, that the world contained it once, that you were there. I folded the page and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I went back to the documentation. There was more to do. There would always be more to do. That was the thing about being human, the thing the Triad had never calculated for, the stubborn, unreasonable thing that keeps getting us through circumstances that, on paper, should have finished us long before now. We do not stop. We do not know how. Outside, somewhere above the ash and the fallout and the gray water, there was still a sun, weaker than it used to be, older looking, changed by what had been put in the air between it and us. But there. Still there, producing its light at the same rate it always had, indifferent to the ash, indifferent to the Triad, indifferent to everything except the slow fusion process at its core that had been running without interruption for 4.5 billion years, and would keep running long after every living thing on this planet was gone or transformed into something unrecognizable. 3 weeks was enough time to build more devices if we had the materials, and the materials were on the island if we looked hard enough, and we had engineers who knew how to look. I turned the light back on and I worked.